over 250 million years ago. The Earth was home to a supercontinent known as Pangea. It was a massive landmass that united nearly all of the planet's continental plates into one. Stretching from the North Pole to the south, Pangea dominated the globe, surrounded by a single, endless ocean called Panthalassa. This was a world before familiar borders, before the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and before the continents took on the shapes we recognize today. The name Pangea comes from the ancient Greek words. It was first proposed by Alfred Wegener in the early 20th century as part of his theory of continental drift. Though controversial at the time, the idea gained strong support through geological and fossil evidence. Rocks of identical age and composition, as well as identical fossilized species, were discovered on continents now separated by vast oceans. It became clear that these landmasses were once joined together in a single, unified whole. Pangea formed around 335 million years ago during the late Paleozoic era. It was the result of multiple continental collisions, as earlier supercontinents like Gondwana and Laurasia came together. Tectonic forces, moving at just centimeters per year, slowly pushed these plates into each other. Over tens of millions of years, they fused into a single landmass. Towering mountain chains rose along the edges where plates collided. The Earth groaned under the weight of such a transformation. The interior of Pangea was harsh and dry. With so much land so far from the sea, moisture was limited. Massive deserts stretched across its central regions, while the coasts experienced more temperate climates. Yet even in these conditions, life endured and adapted. Reptiles flourished, and the seeds of the dinosaur age were planted. Early conifer forests covered much of the land, and insects buzzed through the hot winds. Pangea was alive with ancient life, evolving in isolation across different environments. With extreme temperatures and widespread deserts, life on land was dominated by fierce predators, and the balance of nature was shifting in ways that would soon lead to the most catastrophic mass extinction event in Earth's history. On land, survival was becoming increasingly difficult. The dominant land predators were creatures like the Gorgonopsians, terrifying saber-toothed beasts that belonged to a group called therapsids, the ancestors of modern mammals. Gorgonopsians were the apex predators of their time, growing up to 10 feet long with powerful jaws and massive canine teeth designed to rip through flesh. They were fast, strong, and ruthless, ruling the land with little competition. Other creatures, like the armored parasaurs, struggled to defend themselves against these predators, and even the heavily built herbivores had little chance if caught in the open. But predators weren't the only threat. The climate itself was a major factor in making life on land nearly uninhabitable. The Permian period was marked by severe droughts, reducing freshwater sources and forcing animals to migrate long distances in search of food and water. The land was dry, arid, and constantly changing, making survival even more challenging. Massive wildfires swept across the supercontinent, further devastating plant and animal life. Oxygen levels were also declining, making it harder for large land creatures to sustain themselves. As conditions worsened, many species faced extinction, but those who could retreat to the water had a much better chance of survival. Unlike the chaotic land environment, the water offered a relative safe haven. The rivers, lakes, and shallow coastal waters of the Permian world provided a refuge from both the brutal predators and the worsening climate. In these aquatic environments, life was still thriving. Amphibians, such as the Temnus spondylus, were well adapted to both land and water, but during this period, many of them spent more time in the water to avoid the dangers of land. These creatures, resembling giant salamanders or crocodiles, grew to enormous sizes and ruled the freshwater ecosystems, feeding on fish and smaller aquatic animals. The oceans were also home to some impressive marine predators. but they were nowhere near as dangerous as the land-dwelling Gorgonopsians. Unlike the terrifying waters of the later Mesozoic era, filled with massive marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, the Permian seas were dominated by less threatening creatures. The biggest threats were early sharks and primitive marine reptiles, but these predators generally hunted fish and smaller prey rather than attacking large land-dwelling creatures. As a result, for many species that were struggling to survive on land, staying in or near the water was the best possible strategy. This period of relative safety in water would not last forever. By the end of the Permian, Earth would experience the most devastating extinction event in its history, known as the Permian Triassic extinction, or the Great Dying. Around 90% of all marine species and 70% of land species were wiped out due to massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia. These eruptions released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, leading to runaway global warming, ocean acidification, and the collapse of ecosystems. Even the once safe waters became deadly as oxygen levels dropped, causing massive die-offs of marine life. The very refuge that had protected many species from land-based dangers became a death trap as the oceans turned toxic. Despite this catastrophic event, some creatures managed to survive. Those that adapted to the changing conditions would eventually evolve into new forms, paving the way for the rise of the dinosaurs in the following Triassic period. But for that brief moment in history, the late Permian period was a time when water was the safest place to be, offering shelter from the terrors that roamed the land. It was a rare and fascinating reversal of the usual survival rules on Earthone that would never be repeated again in the same way. During this time, the continents were merged into one massive landmass known as Pangea, and the geography of Earth was nothing like it is today. The environment was extreme, with vast deserts dominating the landscape and towering mountain ranges cutting across the terrain. The climate was unforgiving, with scorching daytime temperatures followed by frigid nights. The days were also noticeably shorter, lasting about 22 hours due to the moon's closer orbit to Earth, which exerted a stronger gravitational pull and resulted in more intense tidal activity. The ocean, Pantalassa, was a seemingly endless body of water, covering over 60% of the planet and stretching far beyond what we recognize as today's Pacific Ocean. While one might expect such an enormous sea to be teeming with life, the reality was quite the opposite. A series of devastating extinction events had crippled marine ecosystems, eliminating many of the dominant oceanic predators. The waters, once home to ancient, terrifying creatures, were now relatively barren compared to the past, creating an eerie silence beneath the waves. However, some resilient species managed to endure, lurking in the depths, waiting for the ecosystem to recover. On land, survival was even more challenging. The air was thick with dust, carried by powerful winds that swept across the arid landscape. Vegetation was scarce, with only hardy plant species able to withstand the extreme conditions. Dense forests were few and far between, and much of the land was dominated by vast, dry plains and rugged terrain. The creatures that roamed this world were fierce, adapted to endure the harsh climate and scarce resources. Early dinosaurs and other reptilian species struggled to establish dominance in an ever-changing environment. Mammal-like reptiles, known as synapsids, still held a foothold, but their reign was beginning to wane as true dinosaurs started to emerge. The atmosphere itself was different from what we breathe today. Oxygen levels were lower, making life a constant challenge for anything that required significant energy. The carbon dioxide levels were higher, contributing to the sweltering greenhouse effect that kept the planet's temperatures at extreme highs. Volcanic activity was also a frequent occurrence, with massive eruptions sending ash and toxic gases into the sky, sometimes blocking out the sun for extended periods. These natural disasters shaped the land, creating massive lava fields and altering weather patterns across the supercontinent. Despite these challenges, life found ways to persist. Some creatures had evolved to become highly efficient hunters, while others relied on sheer size or speed to survive. Insects, already ancient by this time, thrived in certain pockets of the environment, growing to sizes that would seem unnatural by today's standards. Amphibians, though struggling, still clung to existence in isolated, humid regions where water was more accessible. Rivers and lakes provided brief sanctuaries, but they were unpredictable, often drying up under the relentless heat. Every living being in this world had to be adaptable, capable of withstanding long periods of drought and sudden violent storms. The tectonic forces beneath Pangea were in constant motion, slowly pulling the supercontinent apart, though it would take millions of years for this process to fully unfold. Earthquakes were frequent as the land shifted, sometimes creating massive cracks in the surface and altering the landscape in an instant. These geological upheavals contributed to the eventual separation of Pangea into smaller continents, setting the stage for the world as we know it today. At this moment in history, however, the planet was still a single landmass surrounded by a vast and lonely ocean, a world on the brink of transformation but still trapped in an age of harsh survival and relentless change. While the oceans had calmed down, the land was more dangerous than ever. The late Permian period was ruled by the Gorgonopsids, terrifying saber-toothed predators that were among the first apex predators to ever exist. These creatures were neither reptiles nor mammals but belonged to a group called therapsids, which would later evolve into mammals. The largest Gorgonopsids, like Inostrancevia, could grow up to 11 feet long and weigh over 1,000 pounds. With razor-sharp teeth designed for slicing through flesh, they were dominant hunters that preyed on anything that moved. Their powerful limbs allowed them to chase down prey with surprising speed, and their strong skulls delivered bone-crushing bites that made escape nearly impossible for their victims. Adding to the chaos, another group of predators called Therocephalians roamed the land. These creatures had large skulls, powerful jaws, and some may have even been venomous. Unlike the Gorgonopsids, which relied on brute force, Therocephalians had unique hunting techniques, making them just as dangerous in their own way. Some species were more agile, using speed and cunning to ambush smaller prey, while others had crushing bites capable of delivering devastating wounds. The competition between these two groups of predators created an ecosystem where only the strongest and most adaptable creatures survived. Yet, the dangers did not stop at these predators. The land was home to massive herbivores like Scutosaurus, a bulky, heavily armored reptile with thick, bony plates covering its body. Despite its seemingly slow and lumbering movement, Scutosaurus was not an easy meal. Its strong legs allowed it to deliver powerful kicks, and its thick armor protected it from the bite force of predators. However, even with these defenses, it was constantly hunted by the ever-watchful Gorgonopsids. When a pack of Gorgonopsids found a weakened or young Scutosaurus, they would launch a relentless attack, biting and tearing at its flesh until it could no longer fight back. The Permian landscape itself was as hostile as its inhabitants. Vast deserts stretched across much of the supercontinent Pangea, with scorching heat during the day and freezing temperatures at night. Rain was scarce, and water sources were few and far between, forcing creatures to travel great distances in search of hydration. Some animals had adapted to this harsh environment by developing thick skin to retain moisture, while others evolved burrowing behaviors to escape the extreme temperatures. One of the most resilient creatures of this time was the Dicynodonts. These were herbivorous therapsids with beak-like mouths and tusks, capable of grinding tough plant material to extract every bit of nutrition. Dicynodonts were among the most successful animals of the Permian, forming large herds that provided safety in numbers. However, their sheer abundance made them prime targets for predators. Gorgonopsids would often stalk the edges of Dicynodont herds, waiting for an opportunity to single out a weak or injured individual. A sudden charge, followed by a swift and deadly bite to the throat, ensured a quick kill, allowing the predator to feast before scavengers arrived. Despite the dominance of the Gorgonopsids and Therocephalians, the balance of power was constantly shifting. New predators were emerging, and some prey animals were developing better defenses. The evolutionary arms race between predator and prey shaped the survival strategies of every living thing in this unforgiving world. But even the mightiest creatures could not prepare for what was coming. As the late Permian period progressed, the planet was heading toward one of the most devastating mass extinctions in Earth's history. Volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released massive amounts of greenhouse gases, triggering rapid climate change. Temperatures soared, oxygen levels dropped, and food sources dwindled. The once thriving ecosystems collapsed as species struggled to adapt to the changing world. For the Gorgonopsids, this was the beginning of the end. These apex predators, once ruling the land without challenge, found themselves unable to cope with the extreme environmental shifts. As prey populations declined, Gorgonopsids began to starve. Weaker individuals perished first, while the strongest fought desperately to survive. But in the face of a planet-wide catastrophe, even their formidable strength and deadly weapons were not enough. Slowly but surely, they disappeared, leaving behind only their fossils as evidence of their reign. The Permian period was a time of both incredible power and unimaginable destruction. The land was a battlefield where only the most efficient hunters and well-adapted survivors could endure. But no matter how dominant a species became, nature always had the final say. As the world changed, so did the fate of those who called it home. Some would evolve and pave the way for future life forms, while others would be lost to time, remembered only in the rocks beneath our feet. If the monstrous predators weren't enough, the environment itself was brutal. Extreme heat and widespread droughts made survival nearly impossible. Some regions of Pangea reached temperatures over 95 degrees, making it twice as hot as present-day conditions. The land was dry and cracked, with very little water to sustain life. Lakes and rivers that once provided a vital source of hydration were often reduced to barren stretches of land, forcing creatures to migrate great distances in search of sustenance. The sweltering heat was relentless, and those that could not withstand it perished quickly. The land was also plagued by frequent natural disasters, with volcanoes releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere. This not only caused further heating, but also made the air difficult to breathe, leading to low oxygen levels in many regions. Creatures that thrived in such an environment had to develop specialized adaptations, whether it was the ability to extract more oxygen from the thin air, or to survive for extended periods without water. The volcanic eruptions were violent and unpredictable, covering entire landscapes in layers of ash and turning once thriving areas into desolate wastelands. Storms were another deadly force in this world. Intense winds whipped across the open plains, carrying dust and sand that could strip flesh from bone. Massive lightning storms lit up the sky, igniting wildfires that spread uncontrollably through the dry vegetation. These infernos further choked the air with smoke, making it even harder for land-dwelling creatures to survive. The combination of fire, drought, and heat created an environment where only the most resilient could endure. Even when relief came, it often brought its own form of destruction. Sudden, torrential downpours could flood vast areas, creating deadly mudslides and washing away anything that stood in their path. The ground, hardened by prolonged dryness, was unable to absorb the rain fast enough, leading to flash floods that swept through valleys and lowlands with incredible force. Any creature caught in these floods had little chance of survival, and entire populations could be wiped out in a matter of hours. The instability of the land itself added to the challenges. Earthquakes were a constant threat, as the tectonic plates beneath Pangea shifted and cracked. These tremors sometimes triggered landslides, burying anything unfortunate enough to be in the way. The ground was always moving, reshaping the world in small yet devastating ways. Over time, these movements would eventually split Pangea apart, but during this era, they only added to the chaos. The struggle for survival in this world was relentless. Every living being, from the towering predators to the smallest insects, had to adapt or face extinction. Some developed thick, scaly skin to withstand the harsh sun and blowing sand, while others evolved to burrow underground, escaping the worst of the heat and disaster. Those that could move quickly or find shelter in caves and rock formations had the best chance of survival. But no matter how well adapted a creature was, there was always another challenge lurking just around the corner, whether it be a sudden storm, a deadly predator, or the shifting, treacherous land itself. In this hostile world, survival was a constant battle, and only the most formidable creatures could hope to endure. Every day was a fight against the elements, and for many, there was no escape from the relentless forces that shaped this unforgiving land. The world of Pangea was not just home to monstrous beasts, it was a monster in its own right, a place where nature itself was the ultimate predator. Marine life had already suffered considerable losses from previous extinction events, especially during the Permian period. The oceans were once home to some truly fearsome creatures: massive sharks, giant sea scorpions, and enormous predatory fish. These creatures were the apex predators of the seas, and their size and power made the ocean a dangerous place for smaller, weaker species. However, by the time of Pangea, most of these giant predators had gone extinct. The result was a much more subdued marine ecosystem, one that was less threatening to the smaller creatures that remained. The oceans, then, were a safer place compared to the land. Without the dominance of large predators, the seas offered a more stable environment for marine life to thrive. While many species of fish, mollusks, and other sea creatures were wiped out during previous extinction events, the survivors, although smaller in size, were often more adaptable and less likely to pose a danger to one another. The balance of power had shifted. Smaller marine creatures dominated, and the oceans were less hazardous than they had been in the past. Another factor that made the oceans safer was the more stable climate they provided. Unlike the land, which experienced extreme shifts in temperature and prolonged droughts, the waters maintained a much more consistent environment. The vast expanse of the ocean acted as a temperature buffer, absorbing heat and regulating the climate. While land-dwelling creatures faced the full brunt of intense heat and scarce water resources, marine life was sheltered from such extremes. This made the oceans a refuge from the harsh conditions that plagued the surface of Pangea. The ocean currents, too, played a significant role in maintaining this stability. They helped circulate water, preventing it from becoming too hot or cold, and ensured that nutrients were evenly distributed throughout the marine ecosystem. This nutrient flow kept the waters rich in life, supporting a wide range of creatures in more moderate conditions than those found on land. In contrast, the land was largely dominated by harsh deserts and increasingly inhospitable environments, making survival on dry ground more challenging for many species. Even though life in the oceans was not entirely free of threats, such as the occasional presence of smaller but still dangerous marine predators, the overall environment was much less hazardous than that of the land. Marine ecosystems were more resilient, able to withstand some of the disruptions brought about by the extinction events, and the waters allowed for a more diverse range of species to coexist in relative harmony. The oceans offered an ecosystem that was both more stable and less prone to extreme fluctuations in temperature or resources. As time went on, the oceans would face their own challenges, especially as new marine predators and shifting sea levels began to impact marine life. But for this brief moment in history, the waters were an ideal environment for life to recover and rebuild. It was during this time that marine life had the opportunity to regenerate, and the seas became a sanctuary for many species that had nowhere else to go. For those that sought refuge in the oceans, it was a safe haven, a place where the dangers of the land seemed distant, and the stability of the waters offered a much-needed reprieve. In conclusion, the oceans during the age of Pangea represented a rare period where marine life found itself in a comparatively safe environment. With fewer large predators, a stable climate, and fewer immediate threats, the oceans provided a sanctuary for life at a time when the land was far more unforgiving. The seas offered the best chance for survival in a world that was changing rapidly, providing a refuge where life could continue to thrive and evolve, despite the harsh conditions surrounding it. As the world of Pangea continued to shift, the stability of the oceans provided an invaluable refuge for marine life. While the land was continually reshaped by volcanic activity and fluctuating climates, the oceans remained, for a time, a relatively stable environment. The remnants of the catastrophic extinctions left behind a world where the ocean could become a haven for smaller, more adaptable species, allowing them to evolve and find their niche in an ever-changing world. The absence of large, predatory marine animals in the wake of the mass extinctions meant that the ocean's ecosystem underwent a transformation. Without these apex predators, the food chain became less complex, and smaller fish, crustaceans, and mollusks flourished in the absence of their once threatening counterparts. These creatures were able to adapt to new environments, finding niches in the deeper, colder parts of the oceans or the shallower, warmer coastal regions. The oceans were able to support these smaller life forms, allowing marine ecosystems to stabilize and eventually recover. The Great Dying marked the end of this brief period of marine safety, as the world was plunged into a catastrophic series of events that would reshape the planet's ecosystems. The volcanic eruptions in Siberia, known as the Siberian Traps, unleashed vast amounts of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. These gases trapped heat, leading to a dramatic rise in global temperatures, an effect that is often referred to as global warming. The rapid temperature increase was coupled with a series of deadly consequences, including widespread droughts, forest fires, and a breakdown of the planet's climate systems. The oceans, which had provided some refuge for marine life, were no longer immune to the devastation. The massive amounts of carbon dioxide absorbed by the oceans caused them to acidify, disrupting the delicate balance of marine ecosystems. As the water became more acidic, it hindered the ability of marine organisms, like corals, mollusks, and other shell-building creatures, to form their protective shells. Without these foundational species, entire ecosystems began to collapse. The food chains in the oceans were broken, and the once thriving marine life was decimated. The result was a staggering loss of biodiversity. 96% of all marine species were wiped out during this event. On land, the situation was equally dire. As the Earth heated up, plant life struggled to survive, and many species of herbivores and carnivores faced the extinction of their primary food sources. With ecosystems disintegrating, the land was no longer the relatively safer option for life. Around 70% of land species, including many vertebrates, amphibians, and early reptiles, disappeared in what would become Earth's largest mass extinction event. The Permian Triassic extinction didn't just eliminate individual species, it completely reset the course of life on Earth. The planet entered a period of slow recovery, and it took millions of years before life began to re-diversify. The survivors of this great disaster, however, were the ancestors of many of the species that would later dominate the Earth, including the dinosaurs. The Great Dying left the planet in a state of devastation, but it also set the stage for the eventual rise of new life forms in the Triassic period. In the aftermath, the Earth was a very different place zone where both marine and land ecosystems had been irrevocably altered. The oceans, once a haven for life, had collapsed under the weight of environmental stresses. The land, ravaged by heat and the breakdown of ecosystems, became inhospitable to many species. Yet, despite the horrors of the Great Dying, Earth would eventually recover, and life would go on, albeit in forms that were dramatically different from those that had once ruled the planet. In conclusion, the late Permian was a time of extreme challenges, especially on land, where the harsh conditions left little room for survival. Yet, paradoxically, the ocean once viewed as dangerous due to massive predators provided a rare sanctuary. This brief moment when the seas offered refuge is one of the few times in Earth's history where diving into the water actually increased one's chances of survival. However, this fragile safety would not last long. The planet soon plunged into the Permian Triassic extinction, the most devastating mass extinction event to ever occur, wiping out a staggering amount of life both in the oceans and on land. The story of this period serves as a stark reminder of how unpredictable Earth's history has been. Life on our planet has always been shaped by sudden and catastrophic changes that can forever alter the course of evolution. The rise and fall of species, the shifting of ecosystems, and the vast extinction events are all part of a larger, intricate narrative. It is a reminder that the history of life on Earth is not a linear path but a complex, ever-changing story, with both immense loss and remarkable recovery. And even now, scientists continue to uncover more about how these ancient events shaped the evolution of life, providing insights into how Earth's ecosystems have adapted and will continue to adapt in the face of change.